Yep.
Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the latest in our hybrid style of whiskey tastings. We're sitting in the little control room here in the corner, and don't feel like you're going to be looking at me all night, because mercy of mercies, tonight is a night you don't have to listen to me talk for an hour and a half about whiskey, because we have some very special guests coming along. G'day to everyone watching on the Zoom channel. I can see there's a few on Facebook and YouTube. I'm going to be looking at my phone a bit tonight. It's not a sign of rudeness to anyone, including yourself, Gordon. I'm going to be trying to monitor everything, but it also means if anything goes down, it's all my fault tonight. So, but if you do have any issues with audio or anything on the Zoom or anything, give us a bell. But for those of you who don't know, my name is Scott Fitzsimons. I look after all the whiskey and spirits here at the Oak Barrel. If you're in the room here tonight and you haven't been to a tasting with us before, toilets are just up the back, plenty of water in front of you as well. If you are taking part from your lounge room, you will have to point out the toilets and the water yourself for that one. And please, if you are from home and drinking all the whiskies tonight, get an Uber from your living room to your bedroom on the way home. But this is something quite special tonight, something we've been wanting to do for a little while. anCnoc for us is a distillery that pops up all the time. It's been at Whisky Fair over the years. It's been amongst other tastings, and it always sells really well. It's always quite popular, but we've never given it a dedicated night to sort of drill down into the distillery. So a plan hatched by myself at Milne at an hour at Baxter's, I think. I probably won't name what hour it was that we came up with this. Basically, scraped together all the whiskies in the country, including one that is we've got the last 2 bottles of, and before it goes. And we're very, very privileged to have, and you know, one of the silver linings of the current world is to have Gordon Bruce all the way from sunny Scotland, I believe it is at the moment. But I'm going to throw to Andrew Milne and Gordon. So big round of applause for both of them, please.
Yes, and welcome everyone. I'm going to be jumping up and down in my seat because I'm normally just walking around a room and throwing my hands in the air. So it's going to be strange to stay sat for the whole night, but I'll do my best. But yeah, it's a time to drink whiskey, really, isn't it? anCnoc is a distillery for us that, as Scotty says, it doesn't fall under the radar as such, but it's sort of quietly sits there and produces some amazing liquid that maybe doesn't get shouted about and seen quite so much. And for something with the heritage and the history, it's a brand that, although is, you know, as a distillery is very old, anCnoc has been around for a long time, but the brand itself is actually relatively recent, only in the last 20 years have we started sort of naming whiskies by anCnoc. So I'm really excited to bring you all these different whiskies that, you know, really show the true character of what we've got. But I'm going to continuously throw to Gordon just so that I don't have to pretend that I remember what I'm thinking of and can use him as my facts man throughout the night. But Gordon is a man with an incredible sort of run sheet in terms of his career. You know, starting back in '88 in Wick. I'm hoping I'm going to get all this right now. In Wick, in Pulteney, and he's gone up in his career at the same time as going down. So he's made it south as he's progressed through in his career, and he's improved in his jobs as he's gone through. So he's gone up in the world whilst going south. But he's started at Pulteney, and you were there for how many years, Gordon?
6.5 years in Pulteney.
And you started there working in the wash, was that right? You were a washman?
Mashman. Mashman. The old days in the distilleries, you had mashman, you had stillmen, warehouse operators, and office staff. Mashman's a place to start. That's the most fascinating part of the whole process for me. It's the area where we've got most variables to play with in the distillery. I'm not sure, are we still getting this audio? It's going very, very quiet from your end.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, that's fine, okay.
And you know, so we'll come to it in a bit, but Pulteney is obviously one of our other brands that we look after within Inverhouse. So we're owned by a company called Inverhouse who look after anCnoc in Knockdhu, Old Pulteney up in Wick, Balblair, and Speyburn as well. We also have Balmanac where we make Caroon Gin, and there's the odd Balmanac single casks kicking around from independent bottlers as well. Has much changed from Pulteney since you were there?
Pulteney, the last 15, 20 years, the capital spend in our sites has been massive. It's been night and day. We used to be owned by Scottish families, and getting money to spend in the distilleries working for Scottish people was difficult. There's no doubt about that. Since Ty took ownership in the early 2000s, it's been night and day, the budgets we've got. If you get a pet project now, you can justify it properly, and it's going to improve upgrade or improve sustainability. Chances are you get the funds to do it. So all of our 5 production sites, they really come on leaps and bounds in the last 15, 20 years.
Wow. So from that, your career then obviously stemmed down into Balblair and a decent stint there. And then you decided to move to a huge city of Knock, where there's more cattle than people and more dogs than houses. Describe
Cheeky bugger.
What's the life like in Knock for you now?
Frantic. It's absolutely manic. We've got 13 houses, a population of 28, and as you rightly pointed out, there's more dogs and sheep and Knock than people. Beautiful part of the world to live in. You've got a 20-mile round trip if you want to buy a pint of milk or a newspaper. It's not a problem. You just adapt to that.
Gordon, you say a beautiful part of the world. We're pretty lucky to live in Sydney, and the temperature's just dropped a little bit for us at the moment. So a lot of the Sydney siders are freaking out a little bit. It's dropped below 20 degrees Celsius. What's the weather like over there it's about 10 a.m. where you are?
Absolutely stunning, with another beautiful, really warm morning. It was only -4 this morning, so that's great. We get a nice frosty day like that. We know we're going to get a bit of sunshine. Spring's in the air. We'll probably hit 70 degrees today, which is fantastic. So it's shirt sleeve weather, boys. That's the.
Let's get drinking some whiskey, I think.
Yeah, I reckon it's about time.
Stop people getting thirsty. So we'll kick off with number 1. We're actually going to start with the right number for once, which is anCnoc 12-year-old. Breakfast whiskey for you there, Gordon.
Well, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. It's a good time to start.
So I think one of the questions that we get asked most about this distillery, and often the 12 is the intro, is probably the obvious one. There's no distillery called anCnoc.
Correct.
Is there? And so do you want to maybe take through the distillery itself and why it's not called what the distillery is actually called?
Mm-hmm.
From this end?
Go on, I'll let you, Gordon.
Okay. Inverhouse, we bought anCnoc in 1988. We bought it from, Diageo Guinness in the days. We bought the distillery with stock. The warehouses are pretty full. So we started bottling, selling anCnoc single malt whiskey. And things were tickety-boo for 3-4 years. And then we all realised there was a lot of confusion. There's another distillery, slightly less well-known, called Nicando. Nicando and anCnoc, the names are very, very similar. So to avoid confusion, we decided to change the name of the single malt whiskey to anCnoc. anCnoc is Gaelic for Black Hill. The hill's really important to us. That's where we draw our water from, 4 small springs up there. anCnoc is Gaelic for the hill, so we've kept the connection with the hill. And we have the Black Hill accent.
It's almost like we prepared something else.
But no, I think it's a great whiskey. This one is, it's a benchmark to what we do as a spirit. The base of anCnoc and anCnoc is actually quite a heavy, sulfury, sort of oily, rich spirit. Which I think when you actually taste the liquid for how we know it, and then in the 12-year-old and other expressions, it comes across as quite a light, floral, sort of citrus-led, delicate kind of whiskey. And I always find it quite interesting that actually the base is starting off as a really kind of oily, heavy, sulfur-based spirit, and it's that maturation in time. And various different processes that we sort of soften that sulfur character.
It's often the case, though. I know with like some of my favorite space siding style of whiskies, it's you get those what we would describe as lighter flavors, but it's all about texture and complexity.
Yeah,
and I think that comes from that weight and that sort of sharper edges in the new make that bring it through a little bit. Gordon, when you're playing with your new make, is that something you're specifically looking at? Is there a certain flavour type?
Yeah, I've actually got a glass of new make here in front of me just now. The challenge for us at the distillery is to maintain consistency in the quality of the new make, and that very much depends on what the weather gods are doing. We're a very water sensitive site, and it does get a wee bit warm here in the summertime. It's far easier to make whiskey in the winter when it's nice, cool, clean, frosty weather. You've got plenty of water to play with. The important characteristics we're looking for, we always keep the strength of our distillate below 70% alcohol by volume. We find if we go above 70, it becomes too clean, too light, and we lose a lot of the congeners that we want to keep in the new make spirit that are going to contribute towards the flavours, taste, nose profile of the mature whiskey. Importantly for us as well, we're also looking for a bit of cereal, a bit of maltiness. In Scotland we can distill the 94.8% alcohol and still call it whiskey. 94.8%. It's so clean, it's so pure. It's vodka by another name. So, as well as the other bits there, we're also looking for that lovely malty cereal note that's come from the raw materials.
Gordon, you talked about starting off as a mashman. Your now title is Distillery Manager. What exactly does a distillery manager do? And is this your job to ensure that all the pieces of the puzzle are still making sense?
Distillery manager these days does pretty much everything. Yesterday I spent the morning filling barrels and pushing them into the warehouse. It's the same as any other industry. We've got less people doing more work these days. 25 years ago, I would have had an assistant manager. Well, I've still got an assistant manager. I would have had a clerk S. I would have somebody to light the office fires in the morning. We would have a full-time warehouse squad. Push gas into the warehouse, take mature whiskey out. These days, it's a wee bit more hands-on. So we're responsible for looking after everything to do with the plant. So how the plant runs, procuring the correct amount of raw materials, the quality we need, health and safety of the guys, well-being of the team. That's no 2 days are the same. It's fantastic. There's so many different aspects to the job.
And you've got quite a good little team with you.
Yeah.
So it's a relatively small team. I thought that was the team. Where are they? There they
Yeah,
are.
the guys are absolutely fantastic. We couldn't speak too highly of the guys. Nothing's too much of a problem. I'm just waiting for a screen to come up here. We're actually a man down there. The guy third from left in that picture, he's moved on to work for somebody else. So we've only got 5 operators just now. The 5 that we have, well, assistant manager Ollie Reid's been here for north of 32 years. The 2 guys on the right of that picture, they're just about the 30-year mark. The guy third from the right is set to hit 20 years. The guy second from the left, he's about the 20-year mark as well. And the new kid on the left, he's only been here 14 years, so he's still learning things. It's a really good, stable team.
And most of these teams, so most of your team came from something before whiskey, didn't they? So they were all skilled in many other jobs rather than starting as distillers. Yeah,
that's quite common in the industry as well. We're recruiting just now to replace the guy third from left. We want somebody with a bit of life experience, a bit of practicality, and more importantly, the right attitude. We can teach, if we get somebody who can have no distilling experience, we can teach the skills, but we can't teach the attitude.
And I suppose it helps to have former electricians and plumbers to keep the place running and working when you're a bit more remote.
Yeah, well, from that last shot, we've got a mechanic, farmer, an ex-sawmill. We've got a carpet fitter. Why we employed a carpet fitter, I'm not quite sure, but that's down to attitude. So it's important the guys can turn their hands to anything. And I'll say that the guys are so good. The guys look forward to coming to work. They enjoy what they do and they go home happy. And it can be the dirtiest, shittiest, it's sort of the dirtiest, smelliest job that they get given to do on site. We could be desludging effluent tanks. It's not a problem. Just roll your sleeves up, get in and do it with a smile. So we're so lucky to have these guys here. We really are. Don't tell them I said that though.
One of the challenges that I find here at the Oak Barrel is, and it gets harder every year, is to find those great whiskies under $100. Like
yep.
That's like a bit of a thing. And whether you are buying for a whiskey store or just a consumer, that's something that you have to go out and find. And I think consistently, the anCnoc 12-year-old is a really banging whiskey for under $100.
Yeah.
Just that, it's light, it's easy drinking. What we'd probably call in Australia in, going over wheat bix. I can see this being very, very, breakfast sort of dram for that sort of stuff. But it's got heaps going on as well.
I think, as you say, it goes back to that base layer of spirit at the start. It's what's on paper a relatively simple whiskey. It's a 12-year-old bottled at 40% bourbon casks. On paper it reads as quite a simple product, but it's that base layer of that quality of the spirit that kind of you get that extra texture, you get that mouthfeel, you get that richness, and just heaps of fruit.
Yeah,
I always get more and more new fruit and sort of maltiness every time I try this.
For those playing at home, the order we're going to go through tonight is 12, 18, 20. It's not? Okay. They're going to ignore the order because, again, it looks like these two are going to jump around a little bit. But that's all right. But it sort of leads into my question. It's very rare these days we get to put 18 and 24-year-olds on a lineup of any whiskey. How important to you is having those age statements on the bottle, and is that something that is potentially under distress, or are you pretty confident you're going to be able to continue that into the future?
Oh, well, that's a tough question, isn't it? I don't get too hung up on age statements, to be honest. I know non-age statement whiskies are available, very commonly available these days. And that can be done for good reasons, or it can be done for less positive reasons. I mean, if we're looking for an age statement, casks are unique. Casks are like people. No two casks are exactly the same. So we find an 8-year-old cask that's got the maturation that we'd expected after 10, 12 years. We're going to use an age statement. We can't touch that cask until that liquid's hit 10, 12 years. So you're maybe limiting yourself a wee bit there. On the other hand, there's so many non-aged products that are probably 3 years and a day, heavily coloured, and okay, some of them aren't particularly pleasant. So that's the other side of the coin. But age statements just now, we've got the 12, 18, 24, and 18, 24. The stocks are quite limited. It's never going to be a mainstream, a supermarket whiskey. I don't know, volumes, we're probably doing, I don't know, 1,000, 1,500 cases a year, 18, 24-year-old. So they are pretty limited, which it's not a bad thing, to be honest.
And those whiskies are evolved through stocks as well, I presume. So, a few years back it was a 16-year-old and a 22-year-old. So
yeah, in the latter days, the 16 years old, it was over matured. Well, it was obviously the age in the labels, the age, the youngest whiskey in the bottle. A lot of the old 16-year-old liquid was 18, 19 years old. So we're selling our shelf sort there with age on the label.
Yeah.
Should we pull into whiskey number 2, which I have absolutely no idea what is, because you come up with it.
So we're going to jump to what's number 4 on your tasting mats, which is the 2002, bottled in 2017.
So those playing at home, we're jumping into the 2002 single vintage.
Now, Gordon, you say on the packaging here it says bottled in March 2017. Do you know when this was distilled, other than in 2002?
No, in a word, no. This is a wee exercise we carried out quite recently for Pete Hart Batch 2, which was launched last year. We were a totally manual operated distillery. This is the distillery computer system here. It's in a notebook and pen. And we find out what cask numbers have been used for specific bottling. It's really easy for us to go and pull the records for that particular era. So I think this is really cool for traceability. We can identify what casks have been used, and we can drill down into the stillhouse log sheets. We can see who's distilled the stuff. We can look at the mash house log sheets. We can tell what malt we've been on, what mash size we've been on. We can tell you who's mashed it. We can tell you who's filled the casks. We can tell you who's pushed the casks into the warehouse. And that's all done manually.
This is obviously an older vintage now. This is the release we have literally 2 bottles left of, and I think that's it in the country.
Yep.
Are single vintages an ongoing concern, or are they something that you do when you have the stocks to do it?
We did them from, I think the first one we did was 1991, which was all bourbon matures, absolutely stunning. We skipped 92, I think. And we were pretty consistent. We had an annual vintage pretty way all the way up to 2002, and then we've skipped a couple of years again. I think the part of the idea, the concept with the vintages, we're looking for something a little bit different. So it's not like a slightly older 12-year-old, or it's not like a slightly younger 18-year-old. So it's just a wee bit of variation, and it very much depends on what casks we have available to play with for that specific year. And you guys last year, you were very, very lucky. You had the 2007 vintage, which was exclusive to Australia. And I did manage to get a wee sample of that liquid, and I was just blown away with it. It was absolutely stunning. Really impressed with that. 2002, you've got in your glasses just now. Once again, I absolutely adored that liquid. You've got 2 bottles in Australia, which is 2 bottles more than I have at the distillery. So I'm serving them the glass with this one. But the vintages they're nice. They're really interesting because they're all different year to year. The standard one for me, if you can still find them, is a 91, 94, 1999. Absolutely blew me away. It was so vibrant, fruity, fresh. It was a gorgeous whiskey. 2002 is fairly similar characteristics to the 16-year-old that we did a few years ago. So it's nice to have a wee bit of variety in the range as well, and just something a little bit different from vintage year to vintage year.
And this is all bourbon cask, and it's where the range kind of changes, I suppose, which I think is nice. This is as we go up through to the 18 and the 24-year-old, we start seeing sherry cask influence in the rest of the whiskies. This is what's kind of really stood out for me. It was that 12-year-old in essence, but it was a completely different style of whiskey. And you were getting a lot more crispness, a lot more freshness to this than the 12. And it's almost lighter in texture, but worlds apart from the 18 and what was the 16-year-old. I think it really kind of shows the great character of that spirit.
The vintages, they've all been 46% of volume, natural colour, non-sheltered as fat as well, which obviously is a nice wee addition. And if you want to put water in yourself to take it down to 40%, feel free to do so. 2002, maybe 1, maybe 2 drops of water. I don't know if you guys got water there. From memory, the 2002, if you put 2 drops of water in, literally 2 drops, no more, you got a bit of aniseed, licorice, fennel coming through, which is definitely not there at 46%.
Yeah, interesting. Out of interest in the room, what's the preference? Is there a favourite between this and the 12? I feel like there's similarities, but I see them as quite different unique whiskies. On your hands for 12.
There's a few pockets of 12 disciples. Yeah, it's incredible value, the 12. I have to say I'm a little bit on the fence. They're very different whiskies. And I think sometimes, again, as I sort of touched on, anCnoc can be, in other tastings, in other environments. I don't think I've personally ever done a proper vertical of anCnoc like this. And I think that concept and doing it this way highlights the intricacies of each dram. But yeah, I'm on the fence with my preference so far. I do know what's coming up, so I'm going to hold over that for a little while. But shall we move on?
Yeah.
What I presume is going to be the 18.
Yes. So number 3 for the room, an 18-year-old for those
number 2
watching at home. Number 2 even.
Good. Number 2 in the room.
That's standing strong. Number 2.
Number 2 in the room. Yeah, the 18-year-old. Couple of votes coming through. Sean Baker, who I know, I think many years ago bought pretty much all of our 16-year-olds, and that was discontinued. He's voting for the vintage, which doesn't surprise me at all. I want to say a quick day to Whiskey is My Jam. He's watching on the Facebook as well, along with a few other people there.
So at this point, we move into a sort of quite a different style of anCnoc again. So we're now kind of looking into sherry cask influence. And I believe, I've drawn a blank, but this is matured both in ex-bourbon and then finished in sherry. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think we're looking at 15, 16 years in bourbon casks and then 2 to 3 years in first fill Oloroso. So we're really getting the best of both cask types with this whiskey. There's still so much vanilla and toffee, citrus notes that principally come from the ex-bourbon casks. Plus you got the added bonus, that lovely dried fruit spiciness coming from the sherry cask. So it's a nicely balanced dram. Sorry, shit, that was your bit, Andrew, wasn't it? Sorry.
Oh, that's delicious.
I know every distillery has their own wood management policy. How many sherry casks are kicking around at NOC? Is it something that you use just for finishes? Does the spirit lend itself to, say, 10, 12 years in a sherry cask?
Very much depends on the sherry cask, Scott. We've got some 42-year-old sherry casks sitting here just now, or it's approaching 42. These casks, it's liquid, we bought with the distillery in 1988. So these casks were filled in 1978. But the casks have been used 3, potentially 4 times. If you can imagine 40 years in a first fill sherry cask, the liquid would be undrinkable. Well, it wouldn't appeal to me anyway. But because these casks have been used 3-4 times, it's given us something else. It's still vibrant, fresh, fruity. It's almost like a whiskey prosecco in the tongue. It's absolutely stunning. So we do see a big difference between sherry casks, between first fill, second fill, potentially third fill. First fill sherry casks, just be a wee bit wary about how long you leave them, because the sherry can just flatten the whiskey completely. I know that appeals to some people. It doesn't really work for me, and you can take too much.
So, Gordon, it's a really interesting point, because I don't know how much you know about Australia and the Australian drinking habits, but we like big flavours. We like it in our food, in our drinks, and other alcoholic drinks outside of whiskey as well. And so we're quite a young drinking nation when it comes to Scottish single malt, but there's been an explosion over the past 10 years. And the ones that have been the trailblazers have been those, cola-looking sherry casks and the rip your head off peat smoke as well. And I think there's like a bit of a maturation of the drinking palate in Australia to appreciate this. And I think it's really interesting on your point, because there's been so many distillers and then even Australian distillers come out and talk about, I got these great casks and my whiskey is black and that's the best thing ever. To hear your point of view saying, actually, we stay away from those first fill sherry casks because they're too intense. We're looking for that second and third. So that concept of subtlety in the maturation process, I think is really interesting for Australian drinkers.
It's funny, I had dinner with a cooper pre-COVID, and the start of the night was very relaxed, it's quite convivial. But as the drums went down over the course of the night, the argument ensued, a discussion, sorry, it wasn't an argument, about what contributes most to a whiskey. And as a distiller, I've got some what I consider absolutely beautiful new make spirit, and I don't want to do too much to that, mask the flavours too much. So the cooper says, no, you can make any rubbish, any new make, put it into a good cask, and you can get good whiskey at the end of the day, which is absolute bullshit. So I think the mix here, we're probably looking at 50% new make spirit influence, 50% cask influence. That's probably the sort of balance we're trying to strike here. And I know other distillers, we're probably looking at 30% new make spirit influence and 70% cask influence. That's a very well-known distillery that will only use first fill sherry cask for their product. I won't name names there. I just be very, very careful with cask selection. It's far too easy just to mass squash the flavours that have come from the new make spirit. I mean, it should be a partnership, it should be a harmony.
You just talk about, you remind me of a saying that potentially a lot of people in the room and watching on virtually may be familiar with, which was coined by Lynn Lark, who's the wife of Bill Lark. And when they were first developing whiskey back in the 90s, they came up with shit in, shit out, which is basically referring to if you make a shit you make and put it in the barrel, you're going to get shit whiskey at the end of it as well.
It's all right. We can sell it to the Australians. It's not a problem.
rowing back to this 18-year-old where this conversation sort of kicked off, I still get the fruit. And I think it was a good word that you used there, harmony. The sherry influence is there and the fruits maybe developed a bit. It's more, plummy, dark fruits and that sort of stuff. But, it's just gained, it's like an elegance, richness.
Yeah, I think it's a texture, it's a mouthfeel. It's, and as you say, you can pick up fruit character in that development, those sherry notes, but it's still got the essence of what anCnoc is.
Can we get some t-shirts made up, like anCnoc branded t-shirts, and on the back just say it's the mouthfeel, it's the texture?
Yeah.
Get some marketing dollars out. We can make this happen.
Hey, you convinced me to come down. No, it is. I kind of share the same opinion as Gordon here in terms of sherry casks. And you can overdo it. You can make it too intense where you're not tasting whiskey at this point. You're tasting a sherry cask.
Just take that microphone.
But I think that's kind of where the important factor comes in. Is actually what's harmonizing that whiskey, what's developing it, what's creating that extra texture and that extra character that kind of lifts it to another dimension, but still shows what the beauty of that is. And I think this is that perfect example of you've got a little bit more richness in your fruit, you've got a little bit more body, but at the same time, it kind of remains true to the character and isn't, the bourbon cask is still the main factor of that whiskey. And I suppose that's kind of segue into production at that point, really, because I think we're probably fairly unique. We're one of 16 distilleries, I think, from memory, that's using worm tubs. But I think as you rightly said, you hold up your pen and say that's our technology. I think you showed me a stick at the distillery and said that was a vital bit of equipment for measuring things in your mash. And the stick was one of the most vital bits of equipment in that room in terms of technology. There's a computer that looks like it's come from the 60s, from a sci-fi movie. There's a wonderful sort of use of using traditional techniques, but being modernized at the same time and sort of being sensible and clever with what you're doing. And I remember you saying once, the hatred for that comment of, why do you do this? Is like, because we've always done this and tradition tells us that we should always do this. And it's a shit answer to why you do something. But at the same time, modernizing isn't for the sake of, don't need to change things and make things modern and fancy just for the sake of making them modern and fancy. I've
been scrolling through. We're up to just
so in terms of in the distillery itself, we're a two-still distillery, and pretty unique stills, I'd say. So we get very little reflux, I believe, Gordon, from that shape.
I don't know. It's probably not the best of pictures. We've actually got really tall heads on both stills. So yeah, we do have pretty good reflux on both stills there. Stills are absolutely still. It's almost a pity that picture's black and white. You get the early, particularly late winter, you get the sun coming through the stillhouse windows and the copper just comes alive. When I've seen people want to rip their clothes off and rub their naked bodies all over the stills, they just look so hot. They're absolutely gorgeous.
It didn't take.
I didn't really say that. Sorry.
There seems to be a habit of people taking their clothes off in your distillery, because didn't you have a similar problem with your worm tubs and some Scandinavian?
The worm tub at the anCnoc is quite unique. It's a big cast iron tank. Sits top of the tank, it's probably 25 foot off the ground. And a group of Norwegian visitors a few years ago, and the guys come from Norway to Scotland every year. Norway's very expensive to buy whiskey, so they come to visit distilleries, drink whiskey, and just have fun. As the tour went on, with the distillery tour, they kept asking questions about the distillery water source. And it's important to us, but you normally get asked this question once in a tour, but they kept asking. And it turns out the mad Norwegians want to swim in the water source for every distillery they visit. Sorry guys, our tanks are storage tanks are 3 miles up on the hill. We don't have time to go there today. So I have the group upstairs at the worm tub, and the water's, I don't know, 20, 25 degrees centigrade in the worm tub. One of the old guys needed the bathroom, so it's coming downstairs to the office. And just coming back out the office door, and I hear shouts and roars of laughter, water splashing over the side of the worm tub, and flip. I sprinted upstairs, and the most surreal thing I've seen in my life, I've got 2 butt-naked Norwegians using my worm tub as a hot tub. So funny. When I should have jumped up and down, got excited, but it was so funny.
And so worm tubs are obviously quite unique in Scotland. So for those that aren't aware, so most distilleries, when we come out of the stills, you go through a shell and tube condenser. So you've got a sort of large circular tube, and within that you've got a sort of coil made out of copper that's quite thin, and the whiskey runs through that. And by doing that, you get all this copper contact, and it kind of softens and strips out is the wrong word, I would say, but it kind of balances and sort of gently takes out some of that sulfurous character in the whiskey. Same as with your stills, where you've got different shaped stills to either sort of hold on to that sulfur character or take it away. Worm tubs are a much sort of larger scale thing, and it's effectively, they vary from distillery by distillery, but it's, as you said, a large bath, very much sort of massive Scandinavian hot tub, with a huge copper coil that's much fatter and wider, and with that you get much less sort of copper contact through that, and much less stripping of that sulfurous character. And how important is that, or how do you factor that into your production and make it, because it's obviously a vital part of what you do, but it's, how do you sort of learn to work with ingredients like that, or with tools like that?
Distillery is a big toy box. That's the best way of looking at it. If you change one little bit in the distillery, it's going to have a knock-on impact or effect further down the line. I'm a frustrated marshman at heart. If you change your mill roll settings by 0.02 of an inch, you're going to change your grist composition, which will change the way the stuff mashes. If you change your mashing temperatures by 0.5 degree either way, if you use the stirring gear in the mash tun too much, you'll open up, you'll disturb the grain bed. You run the risk of pulling small pieces of solids through the false bottom. If you change your washback sitting temperatures, if you change your yeast type you're using, or the quantity of yeast you pitch to a washback, that's going to change the smells, the flavours that are produced during the fermentation, and these pass through distillation as well. That's why I'm so pleased we can still pick up on a little bit of maltiness in the new make spirit. I'm starting to ramble here because I've forgotten the bloody question. If we get back to worms, if we get back to worms again, you're right. I mean, was it 16 or 17 distilleries in Scotland that used worms, and that's probably moved on a wee bit. Quite a few of them. We've got a lot of craft distilleries springing up in Scotland, and some of these guys are moving on to worms as well. So it's probably near the 20 mark now. But the really unusual feature about the worms here is we've got both worms. It's the washworm and the spirit worm. They share a common worm tub. And the worm tub, we pump cold water from nearby barns, 35,000 litres an hour. Pump that into the worm tub. It's a simple pass round the worm tub and then back down to the barn. So we only borrow that water. We're not going to use it for. It's only going to be used for condensing and cooling. Distillery moved on to 7-day production in 2006, and because everything's happening a lot quicker, fermentations are slightly shorter, and everything has to move quicker to achieve production targets. We found the new make become a little bit heavier than it did pre-2006 when we were on 5-day production. So we actually fitted a shell and tube condenser on the wash still, maybe 10 years ago. So we've increased the copper contact. Now, this is a really weird set of shell and tube condensers designed to be installed vertically, and you're supposed to feed them with cold water. we didn't have enough height to put the thing in, so we put it in horizontally. And we don't have enough cold water from the springs in the hill to run the works cooler in the mash house and to run the shell and tube condenser. So we use the same water for both purposes. It's a very, very water sensitive site. So every drop of water we abstract from the springs we'll use 5, 6, maybe 7 times now. So it's a curious setup. I only want that condenser to condense. I don't need it to cool the wine. So we've connected the new condenser up to the pre-existing worm. So that's a really good pub quiz question for you. Can you name a distillery that has a shell and tube condenser and a worm on the same still? And that is a truly unique factor. The worms here are, each worm's 105 foot long. Worm starts off probably 9, 10 inch diameter pipe up at the very, very top, where the light pipe comes off the top of the stills. That stage, the alcohol is all in vapor phase, takes up lots of space. As the worm works its way down the worm tub, the cold water on the outside of the pipe is going to condense the alcohol vapor, cool the liquid down further, so the pipe diameter gradually decreases until 105 foot later, you reach the exit point, the worm tub pipes down to 3 inches in diameter. And honestly, like a politician here, I've answered the question I wanted to hear rather than the question I was asked.
I have to admit, in the last couple of just like intro to whiskey tastings that we do here monthly, just the whiskies that I chose happened to be worm tub versus non-worm tub.
Yeah.
So I've been doing a lot of this. So that was actually excellent to hear someone who knows what they're talking about to talk about that. But where obviously I'm getting the answers that Milnie and I want to hear. But if anyone in the room or on the chat has any questions, feel free to throw them in. But I'm eyeing off another whiskey, I think, because my glasses are empty. And I stupidly in this setup, the whiskies are over on Milnie's side, so I need him to grab them for me. But should we move on to
Number 3, which is 24.
For those playing at home.
Yeah, it's worthwhile pointing out about worm tubs. They're very, very inefficient. They're expensive to run and maintain. The damn things are programmed. They will only ever leak during the night at a weekend. A worm will never leak 8 to 5 Monday to Friday. It's always 2 o'clock in the morning.
But for very sort of old school techniques and sort of traditional techniques, it was interesting to you to say that the Speyburn, who's one of our sister distilleries, is pretty much fully automated. So we spent millions upgrading the distillery and basically getting it to run digitally, which is in itself quite fascinating. You know, I was ready to not be impressed by the idea of turning something in, you know, a human job into a computer-led role. But it's pretty fascinating to sit there in a room and see everything that the distillery can do running straight out from a computer. It just is fascinating to see the process part by part. But you know, that's there to reduce economies and, you know, help streamline processes and make things easier to run. But you're still getting better outputs than Speyburn using traditional techniques. He's nervously looking at me now.
My boss compares a weekly comparison site, so we'll do 5 slides each week. So that's spirit yield, so it's litres of alcohol, litres of pure alcohol per tonne of malt, the energy used to make a litre of pure alcohol, and there's another couple of Mickey Mouse slides there as well. And this is a really good motivational tool for the guys. We're probably we're definitely the least automated site within Inverhouse Distillers. I mean, everything's still done by hand. The guys get a really, really busy shift. They're constantly on the move. It's a level of technology and automation that we're happy with, which is basically none. So, but a couple of years ago, with our previous managing director up in the still house, and he'd spied this weekly report my boss sends through. So we get the bar chart with the spirit yield for the 5 distilleries, and he picks it up and looks at it and says, "No, it's really ironic that the least automated site is the best spirit yielding site." But sorry, that was lost to me. I failed to see why that's ironic. People can always do things better than machines.
Yeah.
while I'm nosing this quite exquisite 24, I think I might jump in here, Gordon, and ask a question that I know Melanie probably isn't allowed to ask, but I know there's some people from the parent company watching this stream. I can see their names. So as much as you can, what's the dynamic between an industry that like the whiskey boom is now? There's no guarantee the whiskey boom will still be as strong or going in 10 or 20 years, but whiskey takes 18, 24 years to make, and you've got very hands-on traditional methods. What's that dynamic between the need to get whiskey on the market and to sell it and holding true to your beliefs and ideals in the making process?
Ooh. Ooh.
Only I can ask this question. He can't.
It's always a very, very tricky thing to judge. I mean, we got caught out a few years ago with Sweden. We launched our 12-year-old in Sweden in 2008, 2009. Appropriately enough, we launched on April Fool's Day, All Fool's Day, 1st of April. I think they were looking to do 5,000 cases in the 8 months from the 1st of April to the end of December. And that actually turned into about, I don't know, was it 12, 15,000 cases? It absolutely flew. And it really caught the Swedes' imagination. It was fantastic. And it's still our biggest single market today. Which created a bit of a problem for us because we can't pick up 12-year-old whiskey overnight. So 12-year-old became very, very limited throughout the rest of the world. And we also had quite a broad range of non-aged special edition products, some of the Peter Arkle bottlings. That was a result of a shortage of 12-year-old. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult thing for the sales guys, the marketing guys, to predict what the actual needs are going to be for stock in 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. I feel another politician's answer coming on.
That's as good as answering, I think, with everyone watching. It's actually quite a good segue into this next whiskey because the 24-year-old is something, if you see it online or you're in the room, I don't really have any to sell because they're arriving on Monday because it is on very slow allocations. If you're making, I think you mentioned about 1,000 cases a year, so we're talking about 6,000 bottles, give there or take. Australia sees far fewer of that. But I think it's really remarkable to have a whiskey of this age. And I haven't even tasted it yet, just been nosing. But looking at the colour, maybe a little bit more sherry in this as well.
Yeah, this is probably 21 years bourbon. And then definitely a full 3 years in first fill Oloroso casks. And whiskey is always a mood drink. I absolutely adore the 12. You can pick that up. I wouldn't say any time of day because it's 11 o'clock in the morning here. It's just a little bit too young. But it's a very, very approachable whiskey. It's a whiskey you can pour a glass at home, sniff it, sit, drink and enjoy. You don't feel the obligation to sit down and sniff and nose and analyse a thing to death. Just pour it, drink it and enjoy it. 2002 vintage, which you guys have, which I don't have, was a Friday night whiskey. If you got friends coming around on a Friday night, it's bouncy, it's zesty, it's zingy, put some tunes on, it's a whiskey to tap your feet to. The 18-year-old probably fall into the same category. The 24-year-old comes into its own for me on a Saturday night, and it's leave me alone world, switch off the mobile phone, big dram, and this is one that you want to sniff and sit and sniff and sit, because half the pleasure's in the nose for this whiskey. Take the dram down the bottom of the garden, and it's just a bit of quiet me time, or maybe with a couple of dogs curled up at your feet. So I mean, it is such a mood product.
I think it's one of the whiskies that when you look at comparatively, if you go and see, all right, well, I need a 24-year-old, 25-year-old whiskey, and you look at what else is out there, the value that this represents in terms of value for money comparatively is ridiculous. And I think it surprises me, and I kind of feel like I'm underselling myself. So quite something quite often because there's something I go, it's how much?
When I first got into whiskey seriously, it was about 9 years ago when I started delving into some premium stuff, and there was always, the pub test was $10 for a year. So your 12-year-old was about $100, your 18-year-old was about $150-$60, and your 25-year-old was $250 and that sort of stuff. That world is gone. And that world is, unfortunately.
They were good days.
But this is still one that passes that pub test. This is a 24-year-old that sits, in Australian dollars, 230, 240 sort of mark.
Yeah.
Which is great. I've actually got a question here coming through on the Zoom from Sean, which is about the 18, but it ties in here as well. Was there any particular drive between the shift from the 16 to the 18? Because I agree that the difference in flavour profiles is quite stark due to that sherry sort of finishing on the 18. Was there more demand for that sort of sherry finished whiskey? And, what's the thinking behind putting the 24 into sherry for a few years as well, if I might expand on Sean's question there?
Okay. Well, if you remember the old 16-year-old, it was only matured in second fill bourbons. And the guy, if you ask the guys here what the favourite expression of anCnoc's been, and they would tell you the 16-year-old anCnoc, it was bouncy, it was zesty, it was zingy, it was just such a vibrant whiskey. It was really cool. Towards the little latter stages of the 16-year-old life, that was 17, 18, possibly 19-year-old liquid we were bottling and selling as 16-year-old, which it probably doesn't make an awful lot of sense. The consumer's seeing 16 on the label, consumer thinks he's getting a 16, doesn't appreciate we've had an extra 2-3 years holding that stock, plus the maturation losses. So I think that was part of the reason for the rebrand, moving from the 16 to the 18-year-old age statement. And I think we had to change the style of the whiskey. There would have been no point in bottling or having a 16-year-old ex-bourbon cask, doing away with that, and then moving from 16 to an 18-year-old ex-bourbon cask, but asking, I don't know, 15, 20, 30 pounds more. So we did have to change the style of the product when we moved from 16 to 18. I don't know if it's reached Australia at all, but we celebrated our 125th anniversary of the distillery in October 2019. We had 2 limited edition bottlings. We had one absolutely stunning. My favourite one from the 2 was a 16-year-old cask strength ex-bourbon casks. UK High Street, I think it's £100. Pretty limited. I think there's only 3,000 bottles of that produced. So if you find a bottle,
I'm not salty about it.
Well.
You're right. Australia didn't get any, unfortunately. It's we're slowly forgiving you for that. It's fine. It's. It
wasn't a personal choice. No.
I feel like it was not long after I saw you, so I feel like there was, just a strongly worded email that just went, "Don't send it to that guy."
Just not so much a question, but a comment coming through on the Facebook stream, which I've just lost but found again. From Adam says, such a sensational story of the least automated site with the highest yield. Going back to what we were talking about before, long-standing, close-knit team, very impressive. So I think those stories are great, and we drink whiskey. There are definitely cheaper ways to get drunk in the world than drinking whiskey, but we drink whiskey because every dram is different, and every dram comes with history and story, and I think that's most evident and identifiable in a dram like this, which has anyone taken a sip of this yet? Probably all finished. I've been nosing for a while. This is elegance, right? This is just tastes like. Any swans where you are? Any swan's blood maybe tipped into this? Because this is really elegant stuff.
Well, while you finish that one off, I suppose we'll move on for everyone else that's ready to the final one, which is quite a change from where we've been going to where we finished, but it's a beautiful style of whiskey that is very different for anCnoc, very relatively new. I think we started peating or using peated malt when early 2000s?
That's right. 2003, or 2003 to 2004.
Yeah.
Bit of background, as a company, as a business, we had to buy peated whiskies from third parties to use in our blends. So a decision was taken back then. We'll process a small amount of peated malt through the knock each year. That'll give us peated spirit for our blends, or peated whiskey for our blends. It was never the intention to launch as a single malt.
But it's a fascinating start of, you know, I quite often refer to this as the gateway drug into peat. You know, we talk a lot about, you know, when you talk to people about peated whiskey, the Lefroy is always the first thing that comes up in conversation. And he goes, "Oh, I don't like peated whiskey because it tastes of bandages and medicine and TCP, and it's oily and terrible."
And you can't hide it.
Yeah.
As soon as you open it, everyone in the bar, everyone at home knows you're drinking whiskey. And
I think peated whiskey kind of has a horrible rap for that. And there's two elements. I always have a story about two people named Pete, and there's Isla Pete and Highland Pete. And Isla Pete's in a pretty bad way. He broke up with his girlfriend, living on a tent on the shores of Bamor, swimming in the sea, keeps on getting cut by the sort of stones and the sand. And so he's sort of loads of bandages, cut up to shreds, sitting by an open fire to stay warm, stinks of the sea and salt. And, you know,
to be fair, we've all been there.
We've all been there. Yeah, it's
not a personal attack.
He's an all right Pete. But Highland Pete, or mainland Pete, is a very different character, and he's, you know, works in the city. He's a bit of a banker, does a bit of finance, probably some fintech stuff. Seems pretty smart, but a bit scruffy. Goes Highland walking on the weekends, and, you know, jumps up and down the mountains. But he's got all his fancy tech gear, so he doesn't get that covered in the dirt and the moss. But he just has this sort of thin underlaying of sort of bit of moss. Maybe gets his tranter out at the end of the day, so you get a hint of smoke off him towards the end. Probably punches a few darts at the end of his day. And then that's really the characteristic of Highland peat and mainland peat in Scotland. It's softer, it's more delicate, it's mossy, it's green, and there's a sweetness that you can provide from this as well. But it's worlds apart from Isla peated whiskey, and I love it for that reason, that it is that soft, gentle introduction. Peat doesn't have to be kicking in the face and shouting at you and, you know, shaking you to death, but it's actually there to sort of go, here's a nice element and a nice added characteristic to a whiskey.
Is there anyone in the room who, or online as well, who maybe doesn't consider themselves a peat fan? I was almost going to say the pedophile phrase there, but that's the oldest Sorry. My joke. I picked it from someone, or about 300 people. So not a peat fan? Yeah, okay. So what do we think of this then? Yeah, okay. Yeah. And so
this one here's drinking heaps smoother for me. It's not as aggressive in my mouth anyway.
Yeah, 100%.
So our apologies to Beam Suntory, but you know, it turns out that Lefroy 10 is a lot harsher than the wonderful. So it's roughly 8 years, I believe. I may have just got myself in trouble for that. Can we confirm general rough mix of ages, Gordon?
Pete Hart batch 2 is
We're batch 1.
We're on batch 1, Gordon.
You're on batch 1.
The last few bottles of that.
About probably 8 to 10 years. Batch 2, I think, 9 to 13 years.
9 to 13. Wow, so quite a jump in batch there.
But that was a really interesting point from the gentleman in the room, and basically exactly what you said. You know, has had not a huge amount of, you know, love for peated whiskies. Tried Lefroy 10.
Yeah.
A bit too intense and aggressive. Gateway drug. You know, finding this far more approachable. That's exactly what you were saying at the start there. And
from this, you can move to another 12 different whiskies that will end up enjoying Lefroy, because Lefroy is delicious once you get to work through those kinks. And I had the same thing with sherry when I worked in wine. One of my tutors that talked me through sherry said, try it once, you'll hate it. Try it twice, you'll hate it. Try it 3 times, you'll hate it. And it's like the 5th, the 6th, the 7th time is like, eventually it'll crack and you'll go, this shit's good. And that's pretty much the same way with peated whiskey. There's a journey that you've got to kind of meander through to kind of work out why that burny, ashy, smoky character is actually quite nice.
And Gordon, in terms of overall production, what percentage of the year are you producing peated spirit? Are we talking about 10% of the year or 1% of the year, or?
It varies a wee bit. I'll do 500 tons of peated malt this year. That's from an overall target. I'll process about 4,000 tons of malt this year. So it does vary a wee bit from year to year. I remember one year I was told I was doing about 40%. My annual production was budgeted for peat, and no. Peat malt's difficult to handle in the distillery. It comes with a little bit of baggage. And it's also really, really hard in your copper plant. If you got any weak spots in your stills or your worms, you'll find them when you're running in peated malt. You'll knock holes in it. So it's more expensive for me to process as well.
That's really, I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Is that a chemical thing, or?
Yeah, I mean, you notice that right through from the start. Well, in the tun room anyway. Peated malt's more acidic than unpeated malt. So it used to be really, really hard to get the stuff to ferment well. That's when we used the older strains of yeast, the distiller's yeasts. We've now got the yeast we're using here, Maori MG Plus, which is a bloody good yeast actually. It's temperature resistant and it's pH resistant as well. So that's great for us in the distillery.
Bloody good yeast.
Yeah.
It's what we're all about here.
Yeast is the most important living organism on planet Earth. I don't think yeast gets enough credit. Like, going in, fermenting for us, and then creating alcohol, which gets to such a high volume that it kills the yeast that created it.
Yep.
I think every morning you should get up and, whatever your morning routine is, before you pour that anCnoc 12 out of your wheat bix, just say a quick thanks to yeast, because it is really unsung hero. Gordon, we had you for an hour and we've definitely overshot that. So I want to say before we let you go, a huge thank you for sitting in front of a computer screen for us for a bit of time. Any final questions from anyone in the room or the chat? Let me know. We can fire them off. But I just want to ask. We've sort of gone through, 5 whiskies here in a vertical, and we're going back to, particularly with the 18 and the 24, to previous eras of distilling. Really, if we all sit here in 10 years' time and do this again, what are we likely to see from anCnoc moving forward? Is it more limited releases? Is the 18-year-old going to have a wisp of smoke in it in the future? Like, in terms of, distillery secrets, what are we looking at?
James, I'm just the daft lad who's paid to make the stuff. I'm not clever enough to be involved in these decisions. I don't know, to be quite honest. We've got some really nice older cask line here. I mentioned those 1978s. It'd be nice to see some of those happening fairly soon. Personally, I favour bourbon matured whiskey. I think it's maybe an age thing. I'm not a fan of these big sherry bombs just now. Maybe that'll come back. Maybe it's a 10-year thing. So hopefully we'll see more, if not first fill, second fill bourbon matured like they're coming from here. I don't know.
Well, look, mate, it's a comment coming through on the Facebook from Rowan says, great session. Always learning something new, and I think that sort of sums it up. Part of being involved in the greatest industry in the world is the fact that there is always something new to try to learn to do.
Yeah.
And, I've learned so much in this hour and a quarter. And I think chats like this and, have you ever been to Australia, Gordon?
Never. No.
We're going to have to fix that. But, in this new world, having you virtually in the room on a big screen that we bought just in time for footy season, turns out Cask distills well. But where you're answering questions that we didn't even think to ask at the start of the night, like that. Just that the first one that springs to mind is the acidity level in peated malts and how that changes your production. I think that's fascinating. So,
and I think as I was hosting a group last night talking about American whiskey, and we were talking about production and barrels, and with bourbon you can only use a barrel once, and I always sort of make the jokes. My parents are both Scottish, and quite tight with their cash at the same time, and so the Americans came up with their one barrel policy because they wanted their coopers and their tree fellers and so forth to keep having lots of money. So they came up with that rule so that these people still have a job and consistently can make money throughout their lifetime. Scotland took the cheapskate approach and just went, we'll keep using these. We'll recycle your, so we can get them second hand. It's like, that's perfect. They brought them across through that way. But what I love about this whiskey is this whiskey then influences an additional whiskey in our portfolio. So the barrels that are used to make peat art, and I presume probably for the previous iterations when we did Cutter and Rutter and Flaughter in the previous editions, these then go to Pulteney, where we make Huddart, which is another one of our whiskies that is matured in ex-peated whiskey casks. So the whiskey itself isn't peated, and that's the gateway drug to the gateway drug, effectively. It's really light peat and really sort of soft hints. But I love that sort of, there's not really anyone else that I can think of doing that. It's that sort of just interesting use of how can we change and how can we adapt and how can we do something different and what does it do? So Huddart is a great example of that. It's obviously you can't take the credit for making it, Gordon, but you can sit there and say, well, they're my casks, and that's where you become the cooper at this point and say, well, it's my good casks that are making your good whiskey.
There's something worth pointing out. This has been quite light-hearted and jovial. There's so much pretentious bullshit spouted and written about whiskey these days that we really are in danger of losing fact. It's supposed to be about fun. It's supposed to be about pleasure. One of the delights for me at home is if you got 6 or 7 bottles of whiskey open in the drinks cabinet at home, is that you think about try making your own wee blends. Before we had a peated anCnoc available, my Christmas Day whiskey a few years ago was a 12-year-old anCnoc, which I absolutely adore, and a little drop, a very small amount of 6-7-year-old peated whiskey. And just made my own wee blend. It made my own lightly peated anCnoc, which was absolutely gorgeous. So please get your viewer to try that at home as well. But for God's sake, measure everything really, really carefully and write it down, because you'll create the most beautiful whiskey known to mankind. And if you don't have the recipe, the ingredients there, you'll never manage to recreate it again. But please just have fun with it, play with it, enjoy it, embrace it. And the most important thing of all, if you're having a peated anCnoc, is treat yourself to a good quality blue cheese. A stinking blue cheese, a Strathdon Blue, a Stilton, Rockford. It's a match made in heaven. Absolutely gorgeous.
You had me at cheese.
Yeah.
James Finnegan says on the Facebook chat, thanks to that daft lady for our drams. So you're already influencing the Australian vernacular, so congratulations. We're very, very lucky in Sydney, and hopefully wherever everyone else is in Australia, to be reasonably off lockdown now. So we're going to go after this. Fortunately, you've got a full day of work ahead of you. But I want to say a quick thank you as we sign off to the social media accounts. Stay in the Zoom for a second. We'll have a chat in the room as well. But thank you very, very much for your time, for your knowledge. And we look forward to the next 24 years of anCnoc whiskies as well.
Nice. Well, thank you very much for having us along tonight. enjoy your drams and we'll catch up soon.
Cheers, Gordon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Matt.
Good night, Australia. Slange.
He says without actually killing social media.